Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight I'm diving into some roommate horror stories that Reddit has to offer. Whether you're studying, working, or just need some company while you go about your day, I'm really glad you're here with me again. And if you are new here, feel free to subscribe because I love reading juicy Reddit stories just like these every single evening. Now we've all had roommate situations that made us question our life choices. Maybe they left dirty dishes in the sink for weeks, or they brought home random strangers at 3 in the morning. But the stories I'm about to share with you tonight go way beyond your typical roommate annoyances. These are the kind of experiences that make you realize some people should probably live alone for the rest of their lives. Anyways, let's dive into these stories. My roommate has been stealing my food and replacing it with identical items, but there's something seriously wrong with the replacements. I've been living with my roommate Alex for about 8 months now. We found each other through a roommate matching app, and everything seemed normal at first. Alex is quiet, pays bills on time, keeps common areas reasonably clean. The perfect roommate, really. About 3 months ago, I started noticing something weird with my food. I'd buy a specific brand of yogurt, eat 1 or 2, and when I'd go back for more, they'd taste completely different. Not spoiled or anything, just wrong. The texture would be off, or the flavour would be too sweet or too artificial. I figured maybe the company had changed their recipe, or I was getting old batches from the store. Then it started happening with other things. My favourite brand of crackers would taste stale even though the box looked unopened. My orange juice would taste watered down. My cereal would be flavourless. At first, I thought maybe I was getting sick or my taste buds were changing, but then I realised something that made my skin crawl. The expiration dates were always different. I started taking pictures of my groceries when I brought them home, including close-ups of the expiration dates. Sure enough, when I'd go to eat something a day or 2 later, the dates would be completely different. Not just a few days off, but sometimes weeks different. Someone was taking my food and replacing it with cheaper, older versions of the same products. I set up a hidden camera in the kitchen, and what I discovered was even weirder than I expected. Alex would wait until I left for work, then carefully open all my food items. But instead of eating them, Alex would pour my milk into a different container, transfer my yogurt into identical cups, and even carefully open my cereal boxes to replace the contents with generic store-brand versions. The most disturbing part was watching Alex eat my original food while standing at the kitchen counter like it was some kind of ritual. Alex would savour every bite, taking tiny portions and making it last for hours. Then Alex would meticulously clean up and arrange the inferior replacements exactly where the original items had been. I confronted Alex about it, and the response was completely unhinged. Alex said that I had expensive taste in food, and it wasn't fair that I got to enjoy high-quality items while Alex had to eat generic brands. So Alex had decided to level the playing field by swapping our food quality. Alex genuinely believed this was a reasonable solution to our income disparity. When I pointed out that Alex was literally stealing from me, Alex said it wasn't stealing because I was still getting food, just not the exact same food. Alex had convinced themselves that as long as the calories and basic nutrition were equivalent, there was nothing wrong with the arrangement. I moved out 2 weeks later. Alex seemed genuinely confused about why I was upset and kept asking if we could work out some kind of formal food sharing agreement instead. That story just ended, and honestly, the psychological manipulation involved in carefully replacing someone's food with inferior versions is next level disturbing. The fact that Alex turned it into some twisted form of wealth redistribution rather than just admitting to theft shows a complete disconnect from reality. Some people really will justify anything to avoid taking responsibility for their actions. Moving on to our next tale of roommate madness. I discovered my roommate has been hosting an underground gambling ring in our apartment while I'm at work. I work a pretty standard 9 to 5 office job, so I'm usually gone from about 7:30 in the morning until 6 at night. My roommate Taylor works from home doing freelance graphic design, so I never thought much about what was happening in our apartment during the day. About 2 months ago, I started noticing weird things when I'd come home from work. The furniture in our living room would be arranged differently. Not dramatically, just subtle changes like the coffee table moved a few inches or chairs turned at different angles. I'd also find strange items that didn't belong to either of us. Poker chips in the couch cushions, playing cards under the kitchen table, sometimes cash that had apparently fallen out of someone's pocket. The smell was another clue. Our apartment would have this lingering odour of cigarettes and cheap cologne, even though neither Taylor nor I smoke, and Taylor usually just wears deodorant. I'd also find empty beer bottles and food containers in our trash that we definitely hadn't purchased. When I asked Taylor about it, the explanations were always vague. Maybe some friends had stopped by to work on a project. Maybe someone had been helping move furniture around for better lighting during a video call. The poker chips and cards were from a game night that happened over the weekend when I was visiting family, but then I started getting complaints from our neighbours. The woman downstairs mentioned that there was a lot of foot traffic in and out of our building during weekdays, always around lunchtime. The guy next door asked if we were having construction work done because he kept hearing chairs scraping across the floor and people talking loudly during business hours. Last week I decided to test my suspicions. I told Taylor I was going to work as usual, but instead I parked around the corner and waited. Starting around 10 in the morning, people began showing up at our apartment building, men and women of all ages, but they all had this same look about them, nervous, constantly checking their phones, carrying small bags or briefcases. By 11:30 I counted at least 15 people who had entered our building and not come back out. I waited until noon, then used my key to quietly enter our apartment through the back entrance that connects to the fire escape. The scene inside was like something out of a movie. Our entire living room had been transformed into a casino. Multiple card tables were set up with serious poker games in progress. People were betting with real money, and the amounts being thrown around were substantial. I saw hundreds of dollars changing hands in just a few minutes I watched. Taylor was running the whole operation, taking a cut from each pot and managing multiple games simultaneously. There was a whole system in place with designated dealers, someone keeping track of debts, and even security guys posted by the windows to watch for cops or building management. I backed out before anyone noticed me and called Taylor from my car. I said I was coming home early due to a headache and I'd be there in 20 minutes. By the time I walked through the front door, the apartment was back to normal. Every trace of the gambling operation had been cleared out, and Taylor was sitting at the computer working on what looked like a legitimate design project. When I confronted Taylor about what I'd seen, the response was incredible. Taylor said it started as just a small weekly poker game with friends. But word got around, and it evolved into something bigger. Taylor was making more money running these games than from graphic design work, and saw it as a legitimate business opportunity. Taylor couldn't understand why I was upset, since I wasn't home during the day anyway, and the apartment was always cleaned up before I got back. In Taylor's mind, as long as I didn't have to see it or deal with it directly, there shouldn't be a problem with running an illegal gambling operation out of our shared living space. I pointed out that we could both be arrested if the police raided our apartment, and that having a constant stream of strangers with large amounts of cash was putting us both in danger. Taylor's response was that I was being paranoid and that the operation was completely safe because it was invitation only. The final straw was when Taylor offered to cut me in on the profits in exchange for keeping quiet about it, like I was going to become a partner in an illegal gambling ring just because we shared a lease. I moved out within the week. Last I heard, Taylor got evicted after the neighbours finally complained enough to building management about all the noise and foot traffic. That story is over. Running an illegal gambling ring out of your shared apartment without telling your roommate is the kind of thing that could land both people in serious legal trouble. The casual way Taylor approached the whole situation, like it was just a side hustle instead of a potentially dangerous criminal enterprise, shows a complete lack of regard for their roommate's safety and legal liability. Let's move on to another story that proves some people have absolutely no boundaries. My roommate started a business selling my personal belongings online and claimed it was helping me declutter. I've been living with my roommate Morgan for about a year. Morgan works in marketing and has always been very interested in minimalism and organisation, always making comments about how much stuff I have compared to them, suggesting I should donate clothes I haven't worn recently, that kind of thing. About 4 months ago, I started noticing that some of my things were missing. Nothing major at first, just items I didn't use very often. A jacket I'd worn maybe twice, some books I'd read but kept on my shelf, a few kitchen gadgets that I'd bought but rarely used. When I asked Morgan about these missing items, the response was always that maybe I'd left them somewhere, or lent them to a friend and forgotten. The disappearances continued, and they started including things that I did use regularly. My favourite coffee mug vanished. A sweater I wore at least once a week disappeared from my closet. Even some of my shoes went missing. Morgan's explanations became more elaborate. Maybe I'd left the mug at work. Maybe the sweater was in my laundry basket, and I just hadn't seen it. Maybe I'd left the shoes at someone's house after a party. I started keeping better track of my belongings, even taking inventory of my closet and making lists of what I owned. That's when I realised the scope of what was missing. Over the course of 4 months, at least 30 items had disappeared from my room and personal spaces. Everything from clothing to electronics to books to decorative items. Last month, I was scrolling through Facebook Marketplace when I saw something that made my blood run cold. Someone was selling my coffee mug, the exact same unique ceramic mug that had gone missing from my kitchen weeks earlier. It was being sold by an account under Morgan's full name, with photos taken in what looked like our apartment. I started searching for Morgan's name on different selling platforms: Facebook Marketplace, eBay, Mercari, Poshmark. Morgan had been systematically selling my belongings online for months. I found listings for my clothes, my books, my kitchen items, even some electronics that I hadn't realised were missing yet. The descriptions on the listings were what really got to me. Morgan wasn't just selling my stuff, but was writing detailed descriptions about each item, like they were personal belongings. My favourite sweater was listed as cozy winter sweater, barely worn, from my minimalist wardrobe clean-out. My books were described as great condition, from my personal library, time to share these stories with new readers. When I confronted Morgan with screenshots of all the listings, the response was absolutely unbelievable. Morgan said they had been helping me declutter my life by removing items I clearly wasn't using regularly. In Morgan's mind, if I hadn't noticed something was missing right away, that proved I didn't really need it. Morgan explained that instead of just donating these items where they might go to waste, selling them online ensured they went to people who would actually use and appreciate them. Morgan saw this as a more sustainable and economically responsible form of decluttering. The most infuriating part was when Morgan offered to split the profits with me, like I should be grateful for this unauthorized decluttering service. Morgan had made over $800 selling my belongings and seemed to think I'd be impressed by the business acumen involved. When I demanded that Morgan stop selling my things immediately and return the money, Morgan said that wasn't possible because the money had already been spent on shared household expenses like groceries and utilities. Morgan claimed this was actually saving me money in the long run. I ended up having to file a police report for theft because Morgan refused to acknowledge that selling someone else's belongings without permission was stealing. Morgan genuinely believed that roommates should help each other live more minimalist lifestyles and that I was being ungrateful for the decluttering assistance. The police were able to recover some of my items from buyers who hadn't picked them up yet, but most of my stuff was already gone. Morgan moved out after getting served with papers for small claims court, still insisting that I was overreacting to what was meant to be a helpful gesture. That story ends there, and I'm honestly speechless at the mental gymnastics required to justify selling someone else's belongings as a favour. Morgan literally turned theft into a personal shopping service and expected gratitude for it. The fact that they split the profits and called it helping with household expenses is just the cherry on top of this disaster. Our next story takes roommate boundary violations to an even more disturbing level. I found out my roommate has been recording me without my knowledge and selling the footage to strangers online. I'm 23, and I've been sharing a 2-bedroom apartment with my roommate Casey for about 6 months. Casey seemed normal during our initial meeting, worked as a freelance photographer, and had good references from previous roommates. Everything appeared completely ordinary until I started noticing some weird behaviour patterns. About 2 months ago, I realised Casey always seemed to know exactly when I was coming and going, even when I hadn't mentioned my schedule. Casey would make comments like, "Oh, you got home later than usual last night?" Or, "I heard you singing in the shower this morning. You sounded happy." At first, I thought Casey was just being observant, or that our apartment had thin walls. Then I started noticing that Casey's photography equipment was always set up in common areas, but never seemed to be used for actual photo shoots. There were cameras on tripods positioned in the living room and kitchen that Casey claimed were for practicing lighting setups or testing new equipment. When I asked about specific projects Casey was working on, the answers were always vague. The turning point came when I was looking for a phone charger and asked to borrow one from Casey's room. Casey got extremely defensive and said I couldn't go in there because of sensitive client work spread out everywhere. But later that day, I noticed Casey had left the bedroom door cracked open while taking out trash, and I could see multiple computer monitors displaying what looked like video editing software. Last week, I got suspicious enough to do some investigating. I waited until Casey left for a supposed client meeting. Then I searched our common areas for hidden cameras. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. Tiny cameras had been concealed in everyday objects throughout the apartment. One was hidden inside a fake plant on our bookshelf, positioned to record the entire living room. Another was built into what looked like a regular wall clock in the kitchen. There was even one disguised as a smoke detector in the hallway outside my bedroom. I found 5 cameras total, all professionally hidden and clearly expensive equipment. They were positioned to capture every common area of our apartment, plus the hallway where I'd be visible coming and going from my room in various states of undress. I confronted Casey immediately when they returned home. At first, Casey denied everything and said I was being paranoid. But when I showed photos of the hidden cameras, Casey's story changed to claiming they were security cameras for our protection. When I pointed out that none of them were monitoring entrances or windows, Casey finally admitted the truth. Casey had been recording me for months and selling the footage to people online. Not just random recordings, but specific requested content. People would pay Casey to capture me doing everyday activities like cooking, cleaning, or watching television. Some buyers had requested footage of me in my pajamas or workout clothes. Casey had been taking custom orders and positioning cameras to get the best angles of me without my knowledge. The most disturbing part was that Casey had built up a whole client base around selling videos of me living my normal life. Casey showed me the website where my footage was being sold, and there were dozens of videos spanning months. People were paying anywhere from $20 to $50 per video, and Casey had been making hundreds of dollars per week off of secretly recording me. When I demanded Casey delete everything and stop immediately, Casey tried to negotiate. Casey offered to cut me in on the profits, saying we could work together since I was going to be living there anyway. Casey genuinely couldn't understand why I was upset, arguing that I wasn't doing anything embarrassing or private in the common areas, so what was the harm in letting people watch? Casey also pointed out that the buyers were mostly harmless people who just enjoyed watching slice-of-life content, and that I should be flattered people found my daily routine interesting enough to pay for. Casey compared it to reality television and said I was getting upset over nothing. I moved out within 3 days and reported Casey to the police for invasion of privacy and potentially distribution of non-consensual intimate imagery. The police took it seriously once they saw the evidence, especially since some of the footage showed me in states of undress in the hallway. Casey was arrested 2 weeks later, and I learned that I wasn't the first roommate Casey had done this to. Apparently, this had been Casey's primary source of income for over a year, just rotating through different roommates and secretly filming them for online buyers. That story just ended. The level of premeditation involved in setting up multiple hidden cameras and building a client base around secretly filming your roommate is absolutely sickening. Casey literally turned their living situation into a non-consensual reality show for profit and couldn't comprehend why that might be problematic. Some people are genuinely dangerous predators hiding behind normal facades. Let's move to another story that shows how roommate situations can spiral into complete madness. My roommate convinced my family that I was having a mental breakdown and tried to have me committed so they could steal my inheritance money. This situation is so bizarre that I'm still processing it months later. I'm 26 and I was living with my roommate Quinn, who I'd known since college. We'd been friends for years before becoming roommates, so I trusted Quinn completely. Last year, my grandmother passed away and left me a substantial inheritance. Not life-changing money, but enough to pay off my student loans and have a decent emergency fund. I was open with Quinn about the inheritance since we'd always shared financial information as roommates, and Quinn seemed happy for me. About 3 months after I received the inheritance money, Quinn started acting strange around me. Quinn would ask weird questions about my mental health, like whether I'd been sleeping okay or if I was feeling stressed about anything. Quinn also started making comments about my behaviour that seemed designed to make me second-guess myself. Quinn would say things like, "You seemed really confused yesterday when you were making coffee," or "I'm worried about you. You've been talking to yourself more lately?" When I'd deny these things or say I didn't remember them happening, Quinn would look concerned and suggest maybe I should talk to someone about my memory issues. The gaslighting escalated over several weeks. Quinn started leaving notes around the apartment, supposedly written by me, containing bizarre or concerning content that I had no memory of writing. Quinn would also claim I'd said things during conversations that I absolutely hadn't said, then act worried when I denied it. Quinn convinced me to give them access to my bank accounts temporarily so they could help monitor my spending and make sure I wasn't making any impulsive financial decisions during this difficult time. Quinn said that people who inherit money sometimes develop psychological issues and make poor choices, and that Quinn wanted to protect me from myself. The situation came to a head when Quinn contacted my family without telling me. Quinn told my parents and siblings that I was exhibiting signs of a serious mental health crisis, possibly early onset dementia or a psychotic break. Quinn provided specific examples of my supposedly erratic behaviour, including detailed stories about me talking to people who weren't there and making nonsensical financial decisions. Quinn suggested to my family that I needed immediate professional help and shouldn't be managing my own finances. Quinn offered to help coordinate getting me into a treatment facility and volunteered to take over my financial responsibilities temporarily to make sure my inheritance money was protected. My family was understandably concerned and arranged an intervention. They showed up at our apartment with a crisis counsellor, ready to help me get the mental health treatment Quinn had convinced them I desperately needed. The whole thing was completely surreal, because I felt perfectly fine and had no idea why everyone was acting like I was having a breakdown. During the intervention, I realised what had been happening. Quinn had been systematically documenting and sometimes fabricating evidence of mental instability to convince my family I was incompetent to manage my inheritance. Quinn had photos of the weird notes supposedly written by me, recordings of me allegedly talking to myself that sounded like they could have been edited, and detailed logs of my supposed erratic behaviour. The crisis counsellor was actually helpful in this situation. After talking with me privately for over an hour, they determined that I showed no signs of mental health issues and suggested that the family might want to investigate whether someone had been manipulating the situation. That's when everything unravelled for Quinn. My family started asking more detailed questions about the evidence Quinn had provided, and inconsistencies began emerging in Quinn's stories. We also discovered that Quinn had been accessing my bank accounts and had transferred over $15,000 to personal accounts, claiming it was to keep the money safe during my supposed mental health crisis. When confronted with evidence of the financial theft and manipulation, Quinn tried to maintain that everything had been done out of genuine concern for my well-being. Quinn claimed to have been protecting me from making poor decisions with my inheritance money, and said the transferred funds were just being held in trust until I got better. But then we found Quinn's browser history, which included searches for things like how to have someone declared mentally incompetent and legal guardianship over adults with mental illness. Quinn had been researching how to gain control over my finances legally by having me declared unable to manage my own affairs. Quinn moved out immediately after being confronted with all the evidence. My family was horrified that they'd almost been manipulated into having me committed based on Quinn's lies. We reported the financial theft to police, and Quinn was eventually charged with fraud and identity theft. The scariest part is how close Quinn came to succeeding. If the crisis counsellor hadn't been thorough in their evaluation, I could have ended up in a psychiatric facility while Quinn gained control over my inheritance money. Quinn had been planning this manipulation for months, carefully building a case that I was mentally unstable. That story is over. The calculated nature of this scheme is absolutely terrifying. Quinn essentially tried to gaslight their way into stealing someone's inheritance by convincing their family they were mentally ill. The fact that it almost worked shows how convincing and manipulative some people can be when money is involved. Trust really means nothing to certain individuals. Moving on to our next tale of roommate horror, I discovered my roommate has been living a double life, and I'm accidentally funding their fake identity. I've been sharing an apartment with my roommate River for almost a year now. River seemed like the perfect roommate during our initial meeting. Professional job, clean, responsible with bills, great references. We split everything 50-50, and River always paid their share on time without any issues. About 6 months ago, I started getting calls and mail for someone named Christopher Martinez. When I told River about it, River said it was probably just a previous tenant whose mail forwarding hadn't been set up properly. River offered to contact the post office to get it sorted out, so I didn't think much about it. But the calls and mail for Christopher Martinez kept coming, and they weren't just random spam. There were calls from doctors' offices confirming appointments, credit card companies, even what sounded like employers calling about work schedules. The mail included bank statements, insurance documents, and official government correspondence. This wasn't leftover mail from a previous tenant. I started paying closer attention to River's schedule and behaviour. River worked what I thought was a standard office job, leaving every morning around 8 and returning around 6. But I realised I'd never actually seen River's workplace, never met any co-workers, and River was always vague about specific job responsibilities when I asked. The breakthrough came when I was homesick from work one day and saw River leave for the usual morning routine. But instead of staying gone all day, River returned about 2 hours later, parked around the block, and entered our apartment building through the back entrance. River was clearly trying not to be seen by me. I watched from my bedroom window and saw River leave again around noon, but this time dressed completely differently. River had changed from professional business attire into casual clothes and was driving a different car that I'd never seen before. River didn't return until the usual evening time. That night, I decided to do some investigating. I searched online for Christopher Martinez combined with our address and found social media profiles, employment records, even a dating profile. The photos were definitely River, but living under this completely different identity. Christopher Martinez had a whole separate life with different friends, different job, different interests. The most disturbing discovery was that Christopher Martinez had been taking out loans and credit cards using our shared address. River had been building credit and accumulating debt under this false identity while living with me. Some of the financial documents I'd seen in the mail were for significant amounts of money. When I confronted River about Christopher Martinez, River initially tried to deny any connection. But when I showed screenshots of the social media profiles and financial documents, River broke down and admitted everything. River explained that Christopher Martinez was an identity River had created years ago to escape from an abusive family situation. River had needed a way to start over completely, so creating a false identity seemed like the only option. Over time, Christopher Martinez had evolved into a full alternate life that River maintained alongside the original identity. River would spend mornings working a job as River, then change identities and spend afternoons and evenings living as Christopher Martinez. River had separate social circles, relationships, and financial responsibilities under each name. River saw it as compartmentalizing different aspects of life rather than doing anything illegal. The problem was that River had been using our shared apartment as the address for both identities, which meant I was unknowingly connected to Christopher Martinez's financial obligations. If Christopher Martinez defaulted on loans or had legal issues, it could potentially impact me since we shared a lease and address. River had accumulated over $30,000 in debt under the Christopher Martinez identity, including credit cards, personal loans, and even a car loan for the second vehicle I'd seen. River had been planning to declare bankruptcy under the false identity while keeping the original identity clean. When I pointed out that identity fraud was a serious federal crime, River said that Christopher Martinez felt like a real person after all these years and that River hadn't meant to harm anyone. River offered to move out and transfer all of Christopher Martinez's accounts to a different address, but the damage was already done. I ended up having to consult with a lawyer to make sure I wouldn't be held responsible for any of the debt or legal issues associated with Christopher Martinez. The lawyer advised me to report the identity fraud to protect myself, even though River had been my friend and roommate. River moved out within the week, and I learned later that River had been maintaining similar double lives with previous roommates for years. Apparently, this was an established pattern of creating false identities and using shared living situations to legitimize them. That story comes to an end. Living with someone who's maintaining an entirely separate fraudulent identity is like unknowingly harboring a fugitive. River essentially turned their roommate into an unwitting accomplice in federal identity fraud, all while pretending it was just personal life management. The casual way some people approach serious crimes is genuinely mind-boggling. Let's dive into another story that shows how roommate situations can become completely unhinged. My roommate started a cult in our living room and tried to recruit me as the second in command. I'm 25 and I've been living with my roommate Phoenix for about 7 months now. Phoenix works remotely doing some kind of life coaching business, which mostly involves long video calls with clients about personal development and spiritual awakening. I thought it was pretty standard wellness coaching stuff until things got really weird. About 3 months ago, Phoenix started having group meetings in our apartment instead of just individual client calls. At first, it was maybe 3 or 4 people coming over twice a week for what Phoenix called consciousness expansion workshops. They'd sit in a circle in our living room, meditate, and talk about releasing negative energy patterns. The group started growing rapidly. Within a few weeks, we had 15 to 20 people showing up for these sessions, sometimes multiple times per week. Phoenix moved all our furniture against the walls to create more space and started burning sage and incense constantly. Our apartment began smelling like a head shop, 24/7. The people attending these sessions were completely devoted to Phoenix. They'd hang on every word, take detailed notes, and refer to Phoenix as teacher or guide instead of using an actual name. They started bringing gifts too: expensive crystals, organic food, handmade items, and sometimes just straight cash donations for what Phoenix called energy exchange. Phoenix began dressing differently, wearing flowing robes and multiple crystal necklaces, and started speaking in this weird pseudo-spiritual way even during normal conversations. Phoenix would say things like, "The universe is calling us to transcend our earthly limitations when talking about grocery shopping," or "We must align our chakras with the cosmic frequency when discussing paying rent." The workshops evolved into something much more intense. Phoenix started teaching that our apartment was a sacred portal between dimensions, and that the group was chosen to help humanity ascend to a higher consciousness. Phoenix claimed to be receiving direct messages from spiritual entities and would channel these beings during the sessions. People started staying later and later after each workshop. Some would sleep on our living room floor because Phoenix said they needed to remain in the sacred space to maintain their spiritual connection. I'd wake up and find random strangers making breakfast in our kitchen, acting like they lived there. Phoenix approached me about 6 weeks ago with what was presented as an incredible opportunity. Phoenix explained that I'd been chosen to be the co-leader of this spiritual movement because my energy signature was compatible with the cosmic mission. Phoenix wanted me to quit my regular job and dedicate myself full-time to helping guide the group toward enlightenment. The offer came with some pretty appealing benefits. The group members were apparently ready to financially support both Phoenix and me so we could focus entirely on our spiritual work. Phoenix showed me bank statements proving that people were donating thousands of dollars per month for the privilege of attending these consciousness expansion sessions. Phoenix also revealed the long-term plan for our spiritual movement. We were going to purchase land in a remote area and establish a permanent community where group members could live together under Phoenix's guidance. Everyone would contribute their worldly possessions to the collective, and we'd create a perfect society based on higher consciousness principles. When I declined the co-leader position and suggested that maybe Phoenix should find a different venue for these large group meetings, Phoenix's reaction was intense. Phoenix said I was blocking my own spiritual evolution and that my negative energy was interfering with the group's ascension process. Phoenix accused me of being influenced by dark forces that were trying to prevent humanity's awakening. The group members started treating me differently after Phoenix shared that I'd rejected my calling as co-leader. They'd give me disapproving looks when I'd walk through the living room, and some would whisper about my spiritual resistance when they thought I couldn't hear them. A few people even approached me individually to explain how much I was missing out on by refusing to embrace my destiny. Phoenix started scheduling the workshops at times when I'd be home, saying the energy work was more powerful when all the apartment's inhabitants were present. The sessions became louder and more dramatic, with people crying, screaming, and speaking in tongues while Phoenix channeled various spiritual entities. Our neighbours complained multiple times about the noise. The breaking point came when I discovered that Phoenix had been telling group members that our apartment lease was actually a spiritual contract, and that anyone who donated enough money could earn the right to live there permanently. Phoenix had accepted deposits from 3 different people who thought they were moving in to join our sacred household. When I confronted Phoenix about illegally subletting our apartment and potentially violating our lease agreement, Phoenix said that earthly contracts and legal documents were illusions that only mattered to people trapped in lower consciousness. Phoenix insisted that the universe had designated our living space as a healing center, and that I had no right to interfere with that divine purpose. Phoenix also revealed that the group had been praying for my spiritual awakening, and that they'd been performing energy healing rituals specifically designed to overcome my resistance to joining their movement. Phoenix seemed genuinely surprised when I said this made me uncomfortable rather than grateful. I ended up breaking my lease and moving out after Phoenix refused to stop hosting the cult meetings in our shared living space. The last thing Phoenix said to me was that I'd realise my mistake once the group achieved their transcendence, and that I'd always be welcome to return when I was ready to embrace my true spiritual calling. I heard from our former neighbours that Phoenix eventually got evicted after the group tried to perform some kind of ritual that involved burning herbs in large quantities, which set off the building's fire alarms at 3 a.m. multiple times in 1 week. That story is over. Starting a literal cult in your shared living room and trying to recruit your roommate as second in command is peak delusion territory. Phoenix managed to turn apartment rent into cosmic destiny and genuinely couldn't understand why anyone would object to having their home transformed into a spiritual compound. Some people will turn anything into a power trip if you give them enough crystals and a captive audience. Speaking of roommates with absolutely no boundaries, let's dive into this next tale. I caught my roommates secretly learning everything about my life to steal my identity and replace me in my own social circle. I'm 24, and I've been living with my roommate Harper for about 10 months. Harper seemed pretty normal when we first moved in together, maybe a little too interested in my daily routine and personal life, but I figured that was just Harper being friendly and wanting to bond as roommates. Harper would ask lots of questions about my job, my family, my friends, even specific details about my hobbies and interests. I thought Harper was just making conversation, so I'd share stories about my childhood, talk about my co-workers, explain inside jokes with my friend group. Harper was an excellent listener and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me better. About 4 months ago, I started noticing that Harper knew things about me that I didn't remember sharing. Harper would reference conversations I'd had with friends that happened when Harper wasn't around, or mention details about my work projects that I was pretty sure I'd never discussed. When I'd ask how Harper knew these things, Harper would say I'd mentioned them before, and I must have forgotten. Harper also started dressing more like me, not copying my exact outfits, but gradually adopting similar styles and colours that I wore regularly. Harper began using the same slang expressions I used, laughing at the same types of jokes, even developing similar mannerisms and speech patterns. It was subtle at first, but over time it became really noticeable. The red flag that made me suspicious was when Harper started showing up to social events I'd been invited to, even though Harper didn't know the hosts. Harper would somehow find out about parties or gatherings I was planning to attend, then arrive separately and act surprised to see me there. Harper always had some explanation for how they'd been invited, usually through a mutual acquaintance I couldn't verify. At these social events, Harper would tell stories about experiences that sounded almost identical to stories I'd shared about my own life. Harper would describe childhood memories, funny work situations, or family traditions that were remarkably similar to things I talked about. People would comment on how much Harper and I had in common, like we were meant to be roommates. Last month, I decided to test whether Harper was somehow monitoring my communications. I made up a completely fake story about planning a surprise birthday party for my friend Rachel, including specific details about the venue, time, and guest list. I only shared this information in a group text with my closest friends, and I never mentioned it out loud in our apartment. 2 days later, Harper casually asked me how the planning was going for Rachel's surprise party and referenced specific details that I'd only shared in that private group text. When I asked how Harper knew about the party, Harper said Rachel had mentioned it during a conversation they'd had, which was impossible since Rachel didn't even know Harper existed. That's when I realised Harper had somehow gained access to my phone or my social media accounts. I started checking my devices more carefully and found that Harper had installed monitoring software on my laptop while I was at work. Harper had been reading all my emails, text messages, and social media communications for months. Harper hadn't just been spying on my digital communications, though. I found evidence that Harper had been going through my personal belongings when I wasn't home. Harper had photographed documents from my room, including family photos, letters from friends, even my work ID badge and personal paperwork. Harper had created detailed files on my computer containing information about every aspect of my life. But the most disturbing discovery was that Harper had been systematically inserting themselves into my social relationships. Harper had been contacting my friends, family members, and co-workers through fake social media accounts, gradually building relationships with them while pretending to share my interests and background. Harper had been telling people stories about shared experiences that had actually happened to me, effectively stealing my personal history and using it to bond with the people in my life. Some of my friends had started inviting Harper to events instead of me because Harper seemed more available and enthusiastic about participating in group activities. When I confronted Harper with all the evidence I'd found, Harper's response was completely unhinged. Harper said they'd been trying to become a better person by learning from my example, and that studying my life so closely was a form of flattery. Harper genuinely believed that copying my personality, relationships, and experiences was a normal way to improve their own social skills. Harper explained that they'd always struggled with making friends and fitting in with people, so when they saw how well-liked and socially successful I was, they decided to figure out what made me so appealing to others. Harper had been systematically analysing my behaviour, communication style, and life experiences to create a more likeable version of themselves. The scariest part was that Harper had been planning to gradually take over my social circle entirely. Harper showed me detailed notes about each of my friends and family members, including their personalities, interests, and the best ways to maintain relationships with them. Harper had been positioning themselves as a replacement for me in these relationships. Harper had even been applying for jobs at companies where my friends worked, using information gathered from my communications to tailor applications and interview responses. Harper had successfully gotten hired at my best friend's workplace and had been building a relationship with her during their lunch breaks, using inside knowledge about her life to appear incredibly compatible as a friend. When I demanded that Harper stop all contact with my friends and family, Harper said that wasn't possible because Harper had developed genuine relationships with these people. Harper argued that just because we'd met through my connections didn't mean Harper didn't deserve to maintain those friendships independently. I moved out within the week and had to warn my entire social circle about what Harper had been doing. Most people were horrified to learn that Harper had been manipulating them, using stolen information about their personal lives. Several friends said they'd felt like Harper understood them unusually well for someone they'd just met, but now it made sense why Harper had seemed to know exactly what to say in every situation. Harper continued trying to maintain relationships with my friends and family even after I moved out. Harper would show up to events I was planning to attend, forcing me to either avoid social gatherings or deal with the awkwardness of seeing my identity thief in my own social spaces. Some people didn't fully believe my story about what Harper had been doing until they started noticing the copied behaviour patterns themselves. That story ends there. Systematically stealing someone's entire identity to replace them in their own social circle is straight up single white female territory. Harper literally studied their roommate like a research project and then tried to become them while pushing the original out of their own life. The level of calculation and long-term planning involved in that kind of manipulation is genuinely sociopathic behaviour. Our next story proves that some people will turn any living situation into their personal laboratory. My roommate has been conducting psychological experiments on me without my consent and documenting the results in a research journal. I'm 27 years old and I've been living with my roommate, Adrian, for about 5 months. Adrian is a graduate student in psychology, which I thought was cool since I've always been interested in understanding how the mind works. Adrian seemed like the perfect roommate during our initial meeting. Very analytical and organised, always asking thoughtful questions about living preferences and boundaries. About 2 months into living together, I started noticing that Adrian would ask me really specific questions about my daily routine, my stress levels, my sleep patterns, even my food preferences. At first I thought Adrian was just naturally curious or maybe making conversation, but the questions became increasingly detailed and frequent. Adrian would want to know exactly what time I went to bed, how many hours I slept, what I ate for each meal, even how I was feeling emotionally on a scale of 1 to 10. Adrian also started making small changes to our shared living environment. The lighting in the living room would be adjusted to different brightness levels throughout the week. The temperature would vary dramatically from day to day, sometimes uncomfortably warm and other times almost freezing. The furniture would be rearranged periodically, and Adrian would claim to be redecorating or trying out new layouts for better energy flow. I began noticing that Adrian was taking notes during our conversations. Not obviously, but I'd catch glimpses of Adrian writing in a small notebook whenever we talked about anything personal. When I asked about it, Adrian said it was just journaling for personal growth and self-reflection. Adrian also started timing our interactions, checking a watch or phone at the beginning and end of every conversation we had. The weirdest part was that Adrian would sometimes create specific scenarios that seemed designed to provoke certain responses from me. Adrian would leave dishes in the sink for exactly 3 days, then clean them and observe my reaction. Adrian would play different types of music at various volume levels and ask detailed questions about how each genre made me feel. Adrian would even invite different numbers of people over and monitor how I interacted with groups of various sizes. About 3 weeks ago, I started feeling like I was being watched constantly. I'd catch Adrian observing me while I cooked, worked on my laptop, or watched television. Adrian would claim to be reading or working on homework, but I could tell Adrian was actually studying my behaviour patterns. Adrian seemed to know things about my habits that I hadn't even consciously noticed myself. Last week I discovered the truth by accident. I was looking for a pen in the kitchen and opened what I thought was a junk drawer, but instead found a detailed research journal with my name on the cover. Inside were months of observations about my behaviour, sleep patterns, stress responses, and reactions to different environmental stimuli. Adrian had been conducting systematic psychological experiments on me without my knowledge or consent. The journal contained charts tracking my mood changes in response to different lighting conditions, my productivity levels during various temperature settings, and my social interaction patterns when exposed to different music genres. Adrian had been manipulating our living environment as controlled variables in an ongoing study of human behaviour, using me as an unwitting test subject. But the most disturbing entries were about deliberate stress induction experiments. Adrian had been intentionally creating minor conflicts and inconveniences to observe my coping mechanisms and stress responses. Things like hiding my keys and watching me search for them, creating artificial deadlines by claiming bills were due earlier than they actually were, and even staging fake emergencies to monitor my crisis response patterns. Adrian had documented everything in scientific detail, including hypotheses, methodologies, and conclusions about my psychological profile. There were pages of analysis about my personality type, emotional triggers, and behavioural predictability. Adrian had essentially turned our shared living space into a psychology laboratory with me as the primary research subject. When I confronted Adrian with the journal, the response was surprisingly matter-of-fact. Adrian explained that living with someone provided an unprecedented opportunity to conduct longitudinal behavioural research in a naturalistic setting. Adrian saw our roommate arrangement as a chance to gather data that would be impossible to collect in a traditional laboratory environment. Adrian insisted that the research was completely ethical, since nothing harmful was being done to me. just careful observation and minor environmental adjustments. Adrian argued that most people are unconscious of their own behavioural patterns anyway, so documenting them wasn't really an invasion of privacy. Adrian seemed genuinely confused about why I was upset, pointing out that the research had led to insights that could potentially help me understand myself better. Adrian offered to share the research findings with me, suggesting that I might find the psychological analysis interesting and useful for personal development. Adrian had apparently been planning to eventually reveal the study and get my retroactive consent to use the data for academic purposes. Adrian saw this as a win-win situation where I'd get free psychological insights while contributing to scientific knowledge. When I explained that conducting research on someone without their informed consent was completely unethical and probably illegal, Adrian said that formal consent processes would have contaminated the data by changing my natural behaviour patterns. Adrian maintained that the research was more scientifically valid precisely because I hadn't known I was being studied. I moved out immediately and reported Adrian to the university's ethics committee. Adrian seemed genuinely surprised by my reaction and kept insisting that the research had been conducted with the highest scientific standards, just without the traditional consent protocols that Adrian believed would have compromised the study's integrity. That story is over. Turning your roommate into an unwitting laboratory rat for your graduate research is beyond unethical. It's straight up deranged. Adrian, literally, thought informed consent was optional, as long as the science was interesting. The casual way Adrian approached human experimentation shows a complete disconnect from basic ethics and human decency. Some people really will sacrifice any relationship for their academic ambitions. Let's move to another story that shows how living situations can become completely surreal. My roommate started an elaborate fake relationship with a fictional person, and I've been unknowingly playing along for months. I'm 28, and I've been sharing a 3-bedroom house with my roommate Riley and one other person who moved out about 4 months ago. After our third roommate left, Riley mentioned that they had a close friend named Cameron who might be interested in taking over the empty room, but Cameron was travelling for work and wouldn't be available to move in for several months. Riley asked if Cameron could at least start contributing to utilities and rent, even while travelling, since Cameron would be using our address for mail, forwarding, and would move in as soon as the work assignment ended. It seemed reasonable, so I agreed to the arrangement. Riley handled all the communication with Cameron since they were longtime friends, and I never had reason to question the setup. Over the next few months, Cameron became a regular part of our household conversations, even though I never met them in person. Riley would share updates about Cameron's work travels, mention phone conversations they'd had, and even relay Cameron's opinions about household decisions we were making. Cameron apparently had specific preferences about furniture placement, cleaning schedules, and even what kind of coffee we kept in the kitchen. Cameron's mail started arriving regularly, everything from magazine subscriptions to credit card offers to what looks like work-related documents. Riley would collect all of Cameron's mail and claim to forward it to whatever city Cameron was currently working in. Cameron also seemed to have strong opinions about our household grocery shopping, with Riley frequently mentioning Cameron's dietary restrictions and favourite foods that we should keep stocked. About 6 weeks ago, I started noticing some inconsistencies in Riley's stories about Cameron. Riley would mention phone conversations that supposedly happened at times when I could see Riley was actually watching television or reading. Riley would also reference things Cameron had supposedly said about our shared living situation that seemed unusually detailed for someone who had never actually lived in the house. The first major red flag was when Riley showed me text message conversations with Cameron that included photos supposedly taken during Cameron's work travels. But I recognised some of the photos from travel websites I'd seen before, and others looked like they could have been taken from social media accounts. When I asked Riley about the similarities, Riley said Cameron probably got the photos from travel blogs to share examples of the places being visited. Last month, Riley started planning a welcome home party for Cameron, who was supposedly finishing up the work assignment and would finally be moving in with us. Riley spent weeks organising details for this party, buying decorations, planning a menu of Cameron's favourite foods, and even inviting some of our mutual friends to meet Cameron for the first time. The night of the party, I was helping Riley set up when I realised something was seriously wrong. Riley had created an elaborate backstory for Cameron that included specific childhood memories, college experiences, and career achievements. But when I asked follow-up questions about any of these details, Riley's answers were inconsistent. Riley would contradict previous things said about Cameron's background, or provide information that didn't make logical sense. As guests started arriving for the party, Riley became increasingly nervous and kept checking the time obsessively. Riley claimed Cameron was running late due to flight delays, then said Cameron's luggage had been lost, and they were dealing with the airline. As the evening wore on, Riley's excuses became more elaborate and desperate. Finally, around midnight, Riley broke down and admitted that Cameron didn't exist. Riley had created this fictional roommate months ago to help cover rent and utilities during a financially difficult period. Riley had been paying Cameron's portion of the expenses using money borrowed from family, but had planned to find a real roommate eventually and phase out the Cameron story gradually. Riley explained that the fictional relationship had gotten out of hand as I became more invested in Cameron as a future roommate and friend. Riley felt trapped by the elaborate backstory that had been created and didn't know how to reveal the truth without destroying our living situation and friendship. Riley had been ordering mail under Cameron's name to make the fictional person seem more real, and had been creating fake text conversations using a second phone to maintain the illusion. Riley had even been researching travel destinations online to create believable stories about Cameron's work assignments and to find photos that could be passed off as personal travel pictures. When I asked why Riley hadn't just told me about the financial difficulties instead of creating an elaborate fictional roommate, Riley said it seemed easier to maintain the lie than to admit to needing help with rent. Riley was embarrassed about the money problems and thought the Cameron story would be temporary until Riley's financial situation improved. The most bizarre part was that Riley had genuinely started to think of Cameron as a real person after months of creating detailed stories and maintaining the fictional relationship. Riley said it sometimes felt like Cameron actually existed, especially when talking about Cameron's opinions or preferences. Riley had become emotionally invested in this fictional character's life story. I ended up moving out because I couldn't trust Riley after discovering the extent of the deception. Riley had involved our mutual friends in the lie, created fake mail and communications, and had been planning to eventually introduce an actor to play Cameron at social gatherings. The level of commitment to maintaining this fictional relationship was genuinely disturbing. That story is over. Creating an entire fake roommate complete with mail, backstory, and planned social interactions is the kind of elaborate deception that requires serious psychological commitment. Riley literally threw a party for someone who didn't exist and seemed shocked when reality became unsustainable. The fact that Riley started believing in Cameron's existence shows how far people will go to avoid admitting they need financial help. Moving on to another tale that proves some roommates have absolutely no concept of personal boundaries. I discovered my roommate has been secretly recording audio of all my phone conversations and creating a podcast about my personal life. I'm 31 years old and I've been living with my roommate Jordan for about 8 months. Jordan works in media production and is always working on various creative projects involving audio editing and podcast development. I thought it was cool having a roommate in the entertainment industry, and Jordan seemed really passionate about storytelling and content creation. About 3 months ago, Jordan started asking me detailed questions about my personal relationships, especially my dating life and family dynamics. Jordan would want to know specific details about conversations I'd had with my parents, friends, or romantic partners. At first, I thought Jordan was just being a good friend and showing interest in my life, but the questions became increasingly intrusive and specific. Jordan would ask things like what exact words someone had used during an argument, or how long a particular phone conversation had lasted, or what tone of voice someone had used when discussing sensitive topics. Jordan seemed unusually interested in the emotional dynamics of my relationships and would press for details even when I tried to change the subject or keep things private. I also noticed that Jordan always seemed to be around when I was taking important phone calls. If I was talking to my mum about family issues, Jordan would suddenly need to use the kitchen, which was right next to where I usually took calls. If I was having a serious conversation with someone I was dating, Jordan would start doing household tasks that required being in the same area where I was talking. Jordan also started making comments that suggested knowledge of conversations I'd had privately. Jordan would reference things that had been discussed during phone calls that happened when Jordan was supposedly in another room or out of the apartment entirely. When I'd ask how Jordan knew these details, Jordan would claim to have overheard parts of conversations accidentally, or say that I'd mentioned things in passing that I definitely hadn't shared. About 6 weeks ago, I started getting comments from friends and family members about how much Jordan seemed to know about their personal lives. My sister mentioned that Jordan had asked her detailed questions about our family history during a brief encounter at a coffee shop. A friend said Jordan had brought up specific details about their work situation that I was sure I'd never shared with Jordan. The breakthrough came when I was looking for headphones in Jordan's room with permission and found professional audio recording equipment that I'd never seen before. There were multiple digital recording devices, high-quality microphones, and sophisticated editing software that seemed way more advanced than what Jordan would need for the creative projects I knew about. I also found folders on Jordan's computer labelled with dates and times that corresponded exactly to when I'd had important phone conversations over the past several months. When I opened these folders, I discovered hours of audio recordings of my private phone calls, conversations with family members, friends, romantic partners, even work-related calls that contained confidential information. Jordan had been systematically recording every phone conversation I'd had in our shared living space for months. The recordings were high quality and had been professionally edited to remove background noise and enhance clarity. Jordan had been using the recorded conversations as source material for a weekly podcast called Modern Life Chronicles. The podcast featured dramatized recreations of real people's personal conversations, with actors reading slightly modified versions of actual phone calls that Jordan had secretly recorded. My private conversations with my mother about family financial struggles had been turned into episode content. Intimate discussions with romantic partners had become material for relationship advice segments. Jordan had been monetizing my private life without my knowledge or consent. The podcast had several thousand subscribers and was generating advertising revenue through sponsorship deals with therapy apps and relationship coaching services. Jordan had built an entire media brand around secretly recorded personal conversations from multiple sources, with my calls apparently being a primary content source. When I confronted Jordan with the evidence, Jordan tried to justify the recordings by saying that modern life provided incredible storytelling opportunities that shouldn't be wasted. Jordan claimed that the conversations were so emotionally authentic and relatable that turning them into podcast content was actually a public service for people struggling with similar issues. Jordan explained that all identifying details were changed in the podcast versions, so no one could trace the conversations back to the original sources. Jordan seemed to genuinely believe that this anonymization made the secret recordings ethical, even though Jordan was profiting from content created without consent from the people being recorded. Jordan also argued that the podcast was helping thousands of listeners who found comfort and guidance in hearing real-world examples of how people navigate difficult conversations and relationships. Jordan saw the secret recordings as raw material for content that was genuinely helping people, which Jordan believed justified the privacy violations. When I demanded that Jordan delete all recordings of my conversations and remove any podcast episodes that featured my content, Jordan said that wasn't possible because the episodes were already published and had become part of the podcast's archive. Jordan offered to stop recording my conversations going forward, but claimed that retroactively removing content would damage the podcast's credibility and disappoint loyal listeners. Jordan also revealed that I wasn't the only source of secretly recorded content. Jordan had been recording roommates, neighbours, and even strangers in public spaces for over 2 years, building an extensive library of authentic human conversations that formed the foundation of multiple podcast series. I moved out immediately and consulted with a lawyer about legal options for addressing the privacy violations and unauthorized use of my recorded conversations for commercial purposes. Jordan continued producing the podcast even after I moved out, apparently using archived recordings and new sources to maintain the content schedule. That story is over. Secretly recording your roommate's private phone conversations to create podcast content is a massive violation of privacy and probably illegal in most states. Jordan literally turned their living situation into a content farm, harvesting intimate conversations for profit while pretending it was public service. The casual way Jordan discussed monetizing stolen private moments shows a complete lack of respect for basic human dignity. Some people will exploit absolutely anything for social media success. Our next story takes us into territory that makes all previous roommate horror stories seem almost reasonable by comparison. My roommate has been drugging me with microdoses of psychedelics and documenting my behavior changes as part of a personal research project. I'm 26 years old and I've been living with my roommate Sage for about 6 months. Sage is really into alternative medicine, holistic healing, and consciousness expansion through natural substances. I thought Sage's interest in these topics was harmless, just part of a wellness-focused lifestyle that included meditation, herbal teas, and organic everything. About 2 months ago, I started experiencing some unusual changes in my perception and mood. Colours seemed more vivid, music sounded richer and more emotional, and I felt more creative and introspective than usual. At first, I attributed these changes to reduced stress from settling into our living situation and maybe spending more time in nature on weekends. I also started having more intense and memorable dreams, along with occasional periods during the day where I felt unusually connected to my surroundings and more empathetic toward other people. These experiences were actually quite pleasant, so I didn't think much about what might be causing them. I mentioned these positive changes to Sage, who seemed very interested in the details and asked lots of follow-up questions about timing, duration, and specific effects. Sage started preparing elaborate herbal tea blends that were supposed to promote mental clarity and emotional balance. Sage would brew these teas fresh every morning and encourage me to drink them before starting my day. The teas tasted unusual, but not unpleasant, with complex flavours that Sage explained came from rare medicinal herbs sourced from specialty suppliers. Around the same time, Sage began taking detailed notes about my daily routine, mood changes, and behavioural patterns. Sage claimed to be studying the effects of different lifestyle factors on mental wellness, and asked if I'd be willing to participate in tracking various metrics, like sleep quality, energy levels, and emotional state throughout the day. It seemed like an interesting experiment in self-optimization, so I agreed to help with the data collection. Sage also started suggesting specific activities during times when I was experiencing those heightened states of awareness and creativity. Sage would recommend that I try painting, writing, or listening to particular types of music when I mentioned feeling especially inspired or emotionally open. Sage seemed to have an uncanny ability to predict when these enhanced mental states would occur. About 3 weeks ago, I started connecting the timing of my altered perception experiences with when I'd consumed Sage's herbal tea blends. The enhanced awareness and creativity would typically begin about an hour after drinking the morning tea and would last for several hours. When I skipped the tea on weekends, I noticed that the effects were much less pronounced. I decided to research the herbs that Sage claimed to be using in the tea blends. Most of the plants Sage mentioned were legitimate medicinal herbs, but some of the Latin names Sage had provided didn't correspond to any known botanical species. When I asked Sage for more specific information about the sourcing and preparation of these herbs, Sage became evasive and said the exact formulations were proprietary blends developed through years of experimentation. Last week, I found Sage's research journal while looking for a pen in the kitchen. The journal contained detailed documentation of my behavioral changes, mood fluctuations, and creative output over the past 2 months. But instead of tracking lifestyle factors, Sage had been recording my responses to what were clearly psychoactive substances administered without my knowledge or consent. The journal entries describe specific dosages of psilocybin and LSD that Sage had been adding to my morning tea, along with detailed observations about how different amounts affected my perception, creativity, and social interactions. Sage had been conducting systematic experiments with microdosing psychedelics, using me as an unknowing test subject to study the effects of these substances on daily functioning. Sage had documented everything from my productivity levels at work to my emotional responses during phone conversations with family members. The journal included charts tracking my mood changes, creative output, and social behavior in response to different psychedelic compounds and dosages. Sage had essentially been using our shared living situation as a laboratory for unsanctioned human drug experimentation. But the most disturbing entries involve Sage's plans to gradually increase the dosages to study the effects of higher concentrations of psychedelics on my psychological state. Sage had been preparing to move from microdosing to more substantial amounts that would produce more dramatic alterations in consciousness, all without my knowledge or consent. When I confronted Sage with the journal, Sage's response was that the research was actually benefiting me by helping me access higher levels of creativity and emotional awareness that I wouldn't have experienced otherwise. Sage argued that my improved mood, increased creativity, and enhanced empathy proved that the psychedelic therapy was working exactly as intended. Sage explained that informed consent would have contaminated the results because my expectations would have influenced the experiences. Sage believed that the research was more scientifically valid when I didn't know I was receiving psychoactive substances, since this eliminated placebo effects and allowed for genuine observation of the drug's impact on daily life. Sage also claimed that the dosages were completely safe and that the substances being used were natural compounds that had been consumed by humans for thousands of years. Sage seemed genuinely confused about why I was upset, pointing out that I'd reported positive effects from the experiences and had seemed happier and more creative during the experimental period. When I explained that drugging someone without their consent was illegal and could have serious medical and psychological consequences, Sage said that traditional medical research was too restrictive and that real breakthroughs in consciousness expansion required more flexible approaches to studying psychedelic therapy. I moved out immediately and reported Sage to both the police and the local health department. I also had to undergo medical testing to determine what substances I'd been exposed to and for how long. Sage continued to insist that the research had been conducted safely and ethically, and seemed genuinely surprised that I wasn't grateful for the opportunity to participate in groundbreaking consciousness research. That story is over. Secretly drugging your roommates with psychedelics for months is not alternative medicine. It's felony assault and probably attempted murder depending on dosages. Sage literally turned their roommate into an unwilling participant in illegal human drug trials, and thought-informed consent was optional for scientific validity. The casual way Sage discussed administering controlled substances without consent shows a complete detachment from both legal and moral reality. Some people are genuinely dangerous predators hiding behind wellness culture terminology. And that brings us to our final story of the evening, one that proves sometimes the most dangerous roommates are the ones who think they're helping you. My roommate convinced me I had a serious medical condition and was secretly medicating my food to treat my fake illness. I'm 29 years old and I've been sharing an apartment with my roommate Casey for almost a year. Casey works as a medical assistant at a local clinic. So when I started experiencing some minor health issues a few months ago, I thought it was great to have someone with medical knowledge living with me. It started with occasional headaches and some trouble sleeping. Nothing serious, just the kind of stress-related symptoms that come with a demanding job and busy lifestyle. When I mentioned these issues to Casey, the response was immediate concern and lots of detailed questions about my symptoms, family medical history, and lifestyle factors that might be contributing to my health problems. Casey suggested that my symptoms might indicate a more serious underlying condition and recommended that I start keeping a detailed health journal to track patterns. Casey provided me with official-looking forms to document my sleep patterns, energy levels, appetite changes, and any physical symptoms I experienced throughout each day. Over the next few weeks, Casey became increasingly worried about my health. Casey would point out symptoms that I hadn't even noticed, like slight changes in my skin tone or minor variations in my energy levels throughout the day. Casey started researching my symptoms online and would share articles about various medical conditions that seemed to match what I was experiencing. Casey also began preparing special meals for me that were supposedly designed to support my immune system and help address nutritional deficiencies that might be contributing to my health issues. Casey would make elaborate smoothies with specific combinations of fruits and vegetables, prepare herbal teas with precise measurements of different ingredients, and even create homemade energy bars with what Casey called therapeutic supplements. The meals Casey prepared always tasted slightly unusual, but Casey explained that the medicinal ingredients had strong flavors that took some getting used to. Casey would insist that I finish everything because the nutritional therapy only worked if I consumed the full recommended dosages of each component. About 6 weeks ago, Casey arranged for me to have blood tests done at the clinic where Casey worked. Casey said that having connections in the medical field would allow us to get comprehensive testing done quickly and affordably. The results came back showing some unusual markers that Casey said indicated a rare autoimmune condition that required immediate treatment. Casey explained that this particular condition was often misdiagnosed by regular doctors who weren't familiar with the latest research, but that Casey had learned about cutting-edge treatments through professional development courses. Casey offered to help me manage the condition through targeted nutritional therapy that would be much more effective than traditional medications. The treatment protocol Casey designed involved taking specific supplements multiple times per day, consuming specially prepared meals with exact combinations of nutrients, and following a strict schedule of rest and activity designed to support my immune system. Casey handled all the meal preparation and supplement distribution, saying that precision was crucial for the treatment to be effective. I started feeling worse instead of better after beginning Casey's treatment program. The headaches became more frequent and severe. I developed nausea and digestive issues, and I felt constantly fatigued despite following Casey's recommendations for sleep and nutrition. When I mentioned these worsening symptoms, Casey said they were normal parts of the healing process as my body adjusted to the therapeutic interventions. Casey increased the intensity of the treatment in response to my declining health, adding more supplements and preparing even more specialized meals. Casey also started monitoring my symptoms more closely, checking my temperature multiple times per day and asking detailed questions about how I was feeling physically and emotionally. Last week, I decided to get a second opinion from my regular doctor about the autoimmune condition Casey had diagnosed. When I brought copies of my blood test results to the appointment, My doctor was confused because the lab values were completely normal. There was no evidence of any autoimmune condition or other serious health problems. My doctor was concerned about my worsening symptoms and recommended additional testing to figure out what was causing my health decline. When I mentioned the specialized treatment program Casey had designed, my doctor asked to see the supplements and meal ingredients I'd been consuming. The blood tests my doctor ordered revealed elevated levels of several substances that shouldn't have been present in my system. Some of the supplements Casey had been giving me contained compounds that could cause headaches, nausea, and fatigue when taken in large doses. The specialized meals had been prepared with ingredients that could interfere with normal digestion and nutrient absorption. When I confronted Casey with my doctor's findings, Casey insisted that my regular doctor wasn't qualified to understand the advanced treatment protocols being used for my condition. Casey said that mainstream medicine was too conservative and that my symptoms were improving, even though I felt worse than before starting the treatment. Casey showed me the original blood test results again and pointed out the abnormal markers that had led to the autoimmune diagnosis. But when I asked to see the actual lab report with the clinic's letterhead and official documentation, Casey said those records were confidential and couldn't be shared due to privacy regulations. I finally realised that Casey had been fabricating my medical condition entirely. The blood test results Casey had shown me were fake documents created to justify an elaborate treatment program that was actually making me sick. Casey had been systematically poisoning me with unnecessary supplements and contaminated food while convincing me that I had a serious illness that required constant medical intervention. When I moved out and stopped consuming anything Casey had prepared, my symptoms disappeared within a week. Casey continued to insist that I was making a serious mistake by discontinuing the treatment and that my autoimmune condition would worsen without proper medical management. I reported Casey to the medical board and the police for practicing medicine without a license and for deliberately causing harm through fraudulent medical treatment. Casey was eventually terminated from the clinic job and faced criminal charges for assault and fraud. That story ends there. Creating a fake medical diagnosis to justify systematically poisoning your roommate is medical fraud at its absolute worst. Casey literally manufactured an illness to play doctor with someone's health, causing real physical harm while pretending to provide treatment. The fact that Casey had medical training makes this betrayal even more disturbing because Casey knew exactly how dangerous this kind of deception could be. This next story shows how some people have very different ideas about what constitutes shared living space. I moved in with my roommate Cameron about 4 months ago after finding them through a roommate matching app. The apartment is a decent 2-bedroom place downtown, and we split everything 50-50. Cameron seemed normal during our initial meetings, professional, clean, and we had similar lifestyles. Everything was fine for the first couple of months. Cameron works in marketing and keeps pretty regular hours, and I'm a freelance writer, so my schedule is more flexible. We established some basic ground rules about cleaning, guests, and noise, and everything seemed to be working well. The problems started when Cameron began treating our shared spaces like their personal office. It began small, leaving their laptop and work papers on the dining table for a few days at a time. When I needed to use the table for my own work, or just to eat, I'd have to ask them to move their stuff. Then it escalated. Cameron started using the living room for video calls with clients, which meant I couldn't watch TV or even walk through the area during their meetings. These calls would sometimes last for hours, and they'd get irritated if I made any noise in the kitchen or if I needed to get something from my room. The breaking point came when I discovered Cameron had basically converted our living room into their satellite office. They'd brought in a filing cabinet, set up a printer, and even installed some kind of lighting system for their video calls. Our couch was pushed against the wall to make room for all their work equipment. When I came home one evening and found they'd rearranged all the living room furniture without asking me, I decided we needed to have a conversation. I explained that while I understood they needed space to work, the living room was a shared area that we both paid for, and they couldn't just take it over completely. Cameron's response was that since they made more money than me, they should get priority use of the common areas. They said their work was more important than my hobby writing, and that I should be grateful they were helping subsidize my lifestyle by splitting the rent equally, despite earning less. I was stunned. First of all, they had no idea how much money I made from freelancing. And second, we'd agreed to split everything equally, regardless of our individual incomes. But Cameron seemed to genuinely believe that their job gave them more rights to our shared space. Things got worse from there. Cameron started scheduling client meetings at our apartment without giving me any heads up. I'd come out of my room to find strangers sitting at our dining table or in our living room. When I complained, Cameron said I was being unreasonable and that successful people need to be flexible about shared spaces. They also began using our kitchen as a catering area for these meetings, preparing elaborate spreads and leaving me to clean up the mess afterward. Our refrigerator was constantly full of their work food, leaving no room for my groceries. When I tried to make space, Cameron accused me of sabotaging their business relationships. The final straw came when I returned from a weekend trip to find Cameron had given a spare key to their assistant so they could come and go freely to help with work preparation. I came home to find a complete stranger in our kitchen, organising files and preparing materials for Cameron's next day meetings. I told Cameron this was completely unacceptable and that they needed to return to normal shared living arrangements immediately. Their response was to offer to buy me out of my portion of the lease, so they could have the apartment to themselves for their business needs. When I refused, Cameron started making my life miserable. They'd schedule loud conference calls early in the morning, leave their work materials everywhere, and basically try to make it so uncomfortable for me that I'd want to move out. I ended up having to involve our landlord when Cameron tried to claim the living room as a business expense on their taxes, listing our apartment address as their official office location. The landlord was not happy about the potential legal and insurance implications of having a business operating out of a residential unit. Cameron moved out last month after the landlord threatened to terminate our lease if the business activities didn't stop immediately. They left behind most of their office equipment and stuck me with some of their portion of the utilities. I'm looking for a new roommate now, and I've learned to be much more specific about boundaries and expectations up front. It's amazing how some people can convince themselves that their needs automatically take priority over everyone else's, especially when money is involved. The entitlement in that story is just staggering. Cameron literally tried to turn a shared apartment into their personal business headquarters and then acted like their roommate was the problem for not going along with it. The audacity of giving out spare keys and bringing clients into someone else's home without permission crosses so many lines. Some people really do think the world revolves around their career ambitions. Our next tale comes from someone who discovered their roommate had some very unusual nocturnal habits that went way beyond just being a night owl. I've been sharing an apartment with Riley for about 8 months. They're a graduate student working on their PhD in some kind of psychology research, and they keep pretty irregular hours because of their studies and research work. I'm used to hearing them moving around at night, but recently their nighttime activities have become impossible to ignore. It started with weird sounds coming from their room around 2 or 3 in the morning. Not loud music or TV, but strange rhythmic tapping, like someone typing very aggressively on a keyboard for hours at a time. Sometimes I'd hear what sounded like recording equipment being moved around, or the same short audio clips being played over and over again. Riley's always been private about their research, saying it involves human behaviour studies, and that they can't discuss the details due to confidentiality agreements with their university. I respected that and never pushed for more information, but the late-night activities were starting to affect my sleep. When I mentioned the noise, Riley apologised and said their research required them to work during specific hours when they could get the most accurate data. They offered to try to be quieter, but explained that some of their work involved time-sensitive observations that couldn't be rescheduled. The noises continued, and I started noticing other odd things. Riley would receive packages almost daily, always picking them up immediately when they arrived. They'd also leave the apartment at strange hours, sometimes gone for days at a time, then return with what looked like recording equipment or computers. One night around 3 a.m, I heard voices coming from Riley's room. Not just Riley's voice, but multiple people having what sounded like intense conversations. This went on for hours, but I never saw anyone come or go from the apartment. When I asked Riley about it the next day, they said they'd been conducting video interviews with research participants. Last week I had insomnia and decided to get some water from the kitchen around 4 in the morning. As I walked past Riley's room, I could see light coming from under their door and hear what sounded like the same conversation playing repeatedly. The same voices, the same words, over and over again, for what must have been hours. I started paying more attention to Riley's routine. They'd sleep most of the day, then around midnight they'd start what sounded like very focused work sessions. The typing, the audio playback, sometimes what sounded like phone calls or video conferences that would last until dawn. My curiosity got the better of me, and I started noting patterns in the sounds. The aggressive typing would happen in bursts, followed by periods of audio playback, then more typing. Sometimes I'd hear what sounded like editing software, with audio being cut and spliced repeatedly. 2 nights ago, I heard something that made me genuinely concerned. It sounded like someone crying, not Riley, but coming from recordings being played in their room. The crying would play for a few minutes, stop, then repeat. This went on for over an hour, the same crying sounds over and over. Yesterday, while Riley was out, I noticed their door was slightly open, which never happens. I could see into their room partially, and what I saw confused me. Their desk was covered with multiple monitors, professional recording equipment, and what looked like transcription materials. The walls were covered with charts and graphs, and there were dozens of folders labelled with dates and times. I didn't go into their room, but I could see enough to realise that whatever research Riley was conducting was far more extensive and intensive than they'd led me to believe. The setup looked more like a professional surveillance operation than graduate student research. When Riley came home that evening, I asked them directly about the nature of their research and whether it was affecting other people in ways I should be concerned about. They became very defensive and said their work was approved by the University Ethics Board and that all participants had given full consent. But they couldn't explain why their research required such intensive nighttime hours, or why I kept hearing what sounded like the same conversations and emotional reactions being analysed repeatedly. When I mentioned the crying sounds, Riley's expression changed completely, and they said some research involved studying emotional responses to trauma, which required careful analysis. I'm not sure what to think anymore. Part of me wonders if Riley's involved in something legitimate but sensitive, like studying therapy sessions or crisis intervention calls. But another part of me is concerned about the secretive nature of everything and the emotional intensity of what I'm hearing through the walls. Riley has offered to get noise-cancelling equipment for their room, but I'm more worried about what kind of research requires someone to listen to people crying for hours on end in the middle of the night. I've started looking into whether there are any ethical guidelines I should be aware of regarding this kind of research. I'm not sure if I'm overreacting or if my concerns are justified, but living with someone whose work involves analysing human distress on this level is starting to affect my own mental health. That situation sounds deeply unsettling and potentially problematic. Graduate research involving emotional distress recordings should have strict protocols and oversight, and the secretive, obsessive nature of Riley's work raises serious red flags. The fact that they're spending entire nights repeatedly analysing what sounds like trauma responses suggests either questionable research ethics or something even more concerning. This person should definitely look into their university's research ethics board and consider whether they're comfortable remaining in that environment. Now let's shift gears to a story about a roommate whose idea of personal hygiene created some truly unforgettable living conditions. I moved in with my roommate Morgan about 5 months ago, and I genuinely thought I'd hit the jackpot. The rent was reasonable, the location was perfect, and Morgan seemed like a normal, functioning adult during our initial meeting. They had a job, references, and even brought homemade cookies to our apartment viewing. What could go wrong? Well, apparently everything. The first red flag should have been Morgan's response when I mentioned our bathroom cleaning schedule during move-in. They laughed and said they were pretty low maintenance when it came to hygiene, which I interpreted as them being easygoing. I now realised they meant they had completely given up on basic human cleanliness. It started with small things I tried to rationalise. The bathroom always smelled a little off, but I figured maybe the ventilation wasn't great. There were mysterious stains on the shower walls that I initially assumed were just hard water deposits. Morgan's towel always looked damp and had this musty smell, but I thought maybe they just weren't great at laundry. Then I started noticing Morgan's personal habits. They would wear the same clothes for weeks at a time, and I'm not exaggerating. The same jeans, the same shirt, day after day, until the fabric started to look shiny from accumulated body oils. When I gently suggested they might want to do some laundry, they said they were trying to be environmentally conscious by washing clothes less frequently. The smell in our apartment started getting worse. It wasn't just the bathroom anymore. It was this pervasive odour that seemed to follow Morgan around. I bought air fresheners, opened windows constantly, and even invested in an expensive air purifier, but nothing helped. About 2 months in, I realised Morgan hadn't been using soap. Not just rarely, never. I noticed because our shared body wash and shampoo bottles never went down, even though Morgan was definitely showering, because I could hear the water running. When I asked about it, they explained they were avoiding chemicals and had switched to a water-only cleansing routine they'd read about online. The situation escalated when Morgan stopped brushing their teeth. I'm not sure when it started, but I began noticing their breath was consistently terrible, like something had died in their mouth. Our shared toothpaste tube sat untouched for weeks. When friends came over, I could see them trying not to react when Morgan spoke to them up close. The final straw came when I discovered Morgan's bedroom situation. They'd left their door open one day while they were at work, and the smell that wafted out was indescribable. It was like a combination of body odour, mildew, and something rotting. I couldn't help but peek inside to see what was causing it. Their bed had no sheets, just a bare mattress that was stained yellow and brown in multiple places. Clothes were piled everywhere, some clearly dirty, some that might have been clean, but had been sitting there so long they smelled like everything else in the room. There were dishes with mouldy food scattered around, and I could see what looked like bugs crawling on some surfaces. The worst part was the corner of the room where Morgan had apparently been storing their laundry. It wasn't just dirty clothes, it was clothes that had been wet and left to sit until they developed this black, fuzzy mould. The smell was so overwhelming, I had to back away from the doorway. That night, I tried to have a gentle conversation with Morgan about hygiene and cleanliness. I offered to help them organise their room, suggested we could go shopping for cleaning supplies together, even offered to show them some laundry tips if they were struggling with that. Morgan's response was that they were going through a difficult time mentally and that hygiene wasn't a priority for them right now. They said they appreciated my concern, but that everyone had different standards of cleanliness, and they didn't think their lifestyle was affecting me, except it absolutely was affecting me. I couldn't have friends over because of the smell. I was spending a fortune on cleaning products and air fresheners. I'd started showering at the gym because our bathroom was so gross. I was basically living like a guest in my own apartment, trying to minimise my contact with any surfaces Morgan had touched. I gave Morgan a month to improve the situation, offering to help and providing resources for mental health support if that was the underlying issue. But things only got worse. The smell spread throughout the apartment, and I started noticing fruit flies and other insects that seemed to be breeding in Morgan's room. When I finally told Morgan they needed to move out, they were genuinely surprised and hurt. They said they thought we were getting along great and couldn't understand why I was being so judgmental about their personal choices. They accused me of being shallow and materialistic for caring about things like cleanliness. Morgan moved out last week, and I've spent the past few days deep cleaning the entire apartment. I had to throw away anything fabric that had been in common areas because the smell had permeated everything. I'm getting the carpets professionally cleaned and having the apartment fumigated because of the insect problem. The worst part is that Morgan seemed like such a normal person initially. They had a job, maintained friendships, and functioned in society, but somehow they'd convinced themselves that basic hygiene was optional when it came to their living space. I'm being much more direct about cleanliness expectations with potential roommates now. It's awkward to ask someone about their shower routine during an apartment interview, but it's apparently necessary. That story is absolutely nauseating. The mental image of mouldy laundry in the corner and a bare, stained mattress is going to haunt me. It's wild how someone can function normally in public while living in conditions that would qualify as a biohazard. The fact that Morgan was genuinely shocked when asked to move out shows how, completely disconnected from reality, they'd become about basic human hygiene standards. This next story comes from someone who learned that their roommate had some very creative interpretations of what constitutes personal property. I thought I was being smart when I moved in with Quinn 3 months ago. They had great references, a steady income, and seemed responsible during our interviews. The rent split was fair, and we agreed on basic house rules that seemed completely reasonable. What I didn't anticipate was Quinn's unique relationship with the concept of ownership. It started with small things that I initially dismissed as accidents or misunderstandings. I'd buy groceries and notice items disappearing faster than I could eat them. When I mentioned it, Quinn would apologise and say they'd grabbed something by mistake, promising to replace it. They never did, but the amounts were small enough that I let it slide. Then it escalated to bigger items. I bought a nice coffee maker for the kitchen, clearly marked it with my name, and put it on the counter for everyone to use. Within a week, Quinn had moved it into their bedroom. When I asked about it, they said they'd been getting up early for work and didn't want to wake me by using it in the kitchen. Thoughtful, right? Except they never brought it back out. I'd hear them making coffee in their room every morning while I had to use instant coffee in the kitchen. When I finally asked for it back, Quinn seemed genuinely confused and said they thought it was a shared household item since it had been in the common area. The pattern continued with other things. A nice set of kitchen knives I'd bought disappeared into Quinn's room. My good towels vanished from the linen closet. Even my streaming service passwords somehow made their way onto Quinn's devices, and they changed the profile settings so their viewing history dominated the recommendations. About 6 weeks in, I noticed Quinn wearing my clothes. Not borrowing them, just casually wearing my sweaters and jackets around the apartment like they owned them. When I pointed this out, Quinn said they'd found them in the laundry room and assumed they were communal items since we shared the washing machine. The most bizarre incident happened when my parents came to visit. I told them about my living situation, and they brought a housewarming gift for both Quinn and me, a nice bottle of wine and some gourmet chocolates. I put them on the kitchen counter and planned to share them with Quinn that evening. When I got home from work, both items were gone. I found Quinn in their room, halfway through the chocolates and well into the wine. They offered me some like they were being generous with their own possessions. When I explained these were gifts meant for both of us, Quinn said they'd assumed I was saving them for a special occasion and decided to get us started on enjoying them. Things came to a head when I discovered Quinn had been going through my mail, not just accidentally grabbing something addressed to me, but actively opening packages and letters that clearly had my name on them. I caught them red-handed with a package I'd been expecting, already opened, with Quinn examining the contents. Their explanation was that they were being helpful by checking for anything important while I was at work. They said they were worried I might miss something urgent if packages sat by the door too long. They genuinely seemed to believe they were doing me a favour by violating my privacy and opening my mail. The final straw was when Quinn tried to claim my car. I'd been letting them borrow it occasionally for grocery runs or appointments, always with advance notice and clear return times. One morning, I woke up to find my car gone and a note from Quinn saying they'd taken it to work because their usual transportation had fallen through. They kept it for 3 days without asking, using it for their daily commute and personal errands. When they finally brought it back, the gas tank was empty. There were new scratches on the side, and the interior smelled like fast food and cigarettes. Quinn's response was that since they'd been contributing to household expenses, they should have equal access to household resources, including my personal vehicle. I realised Quinn had somehow convinced themselves that living together meant everything was communal property. In their mind, paying rent gave them equal claim to anything in the apartment, regardless of who actually owned it. They seemed genuinely bewildered when I explained that roommates don't automatically share all possessions. When I told Quinn they needed to return all my belongings and respect boundaries around personal property, they accused me of being selfish and materialistic. They said they thought we were building a cooperative living situation where everything was shared equally, and that my attachment to individual ownership was creating unnecessary conflict. I gave Quinn 2 weeks to find a new place and return all my items. Some things came back damaged, others never reappeared at all. Quinn claimed they'd gotten so used to thinking of them as shared items that they couldn't remember what originally belonged to whom. They moved out last month, and I'm still discovering things that are missing. Quinn apparently took the attitude that anything they'd used regularly had become partially theirs through some kind of squatter's rights logic. I had to change all my passwords, replace several items, and have serious conversations with my bank and credit card companies about identity protection. The strangest part is that Quinn wasn't malicious about it. They genuinely seemed to believe that roommates meant co-owners of everything in the shared space. It was like they'd never learned the basic concept that people can live together while still maintaining individual possessions. I'm much more explicit about property boundaries with potential roommates now, and I keep receipts for everything I bring into a shared living space. It's sad that I have to protect myself from someone I thought I could trust, but apparently some people have very different ideas about what sharing space actually means. That story is a masterclass in how some people can rationalize absolutely anything. Quinn basically created their own communist manifesto, where paying rent meant everything became collective property, including someone else's car and mail. The fact that they seemed genuinely confused by the concept of personal boundaries makes it even more disturbing. It's like living with someone who never progressed past the toddler stage of what's mine is mine and what's yours is also mine. Our next tale involves a roommate whose approach to personal relationships turned their shared living space into an incredibly awkward situation for everyone involved. I've been living with my roommate Casey for almost a year now, and for the most part, it's been a pretty standard roommate situation. Casey works in sales, travels occasionally for work, and we've managed to coexist peacefully in our 2-bedroom apartment. That changed about 3 months ago when Casey started what I can only describe as a revolving door of romantic encounters that has turned our shared space into the most uncomfortable dating reality show I never signed up for. It began innocently enough. Casey mentioned they'd started using dating apps more seriously and were excited about meeting new people. I was supportive, figured it was healthy for them to put themselves out there. What I didn't expect was for our apartment to become Casey's primary dating venue for what seemed like every single person they matched with online. At first, it was just occasional dates. Casey would bring someone over for dinner or to watch a movie, and I'd politely retreat to my room to give them privacy. Normal roommate courtesy, right? But then Casey started bringing home different people almost every night of the week. And not just for dates, but for what were clearly hookups that I couldn't avoid hearing through our thin walls. The awkwardness reached new levels when I started recognizing the rotation. There was the person who always arrived around 9 p.m. on Tuesdays, someone else who showed up every Thursday morning and stayed until the afternoon, a weekend regular who would arrive Friday night and not leave until Sunday evening. Casey was essentially running a scheduling system for multiple ongoing relationships right out of our living room. What made it worse was that Casey would introduce me to all of them as if we were going to become friends. I'd come home from work to find Casey and their Tuesday person cooking dinner together, and Casey would insist on introductions and small talk. Same with Thursday person, weekend person, and several others whose schedules I unfortunately memorized because they were in my space constantly. The breaking point came when I realized some of these people had no idea about the others. I witnessed several incredibly uncomfortable situations where one of Casey's regular visitors would show up unexpectedly while another was already there. Casey would frantically try to manage these overlaps, sometimes asking me to entertain one person in the living room while they dealt with the situation in their bedroom. One particularly memorable evening, I came home to find 3 different people in our apartment who had apparently all been invited over at the same time. Casey was juggling conversations between the kitchen, living room, and their bedroom, trying to keep everyone separated while figuring out how to handle the scheduling conflict they'd created. I tried talking to Casey about establishing some boundaries around bringing people over. I suggested maybe limiting overnight guests to weekends, or at least giving me a heads up when someone was coming over so I could plan accordingly. Casey's response was that they were just exploring their options and didn't want to limit their dating opportunities by worrying about my comfort level. Things escalated when one of Casey's regular visitors started showing up when Casey wasn't even home. Apparently, Casey had given them a spare key, and this person felt comfortable enough to wait in our apartment for Casey to return from work or travel. I'd come home to find a stranger sitting on our couch, watching our TV, eating food from our refrigerator, acting like they lived there. When I told Casey this was completely unacceptable, they said this person was practically their partner at this point and deserved key privileges. But then I discovered Casey had given spare keys to at least 3 different people, all of whom Casey described as being in serious relationships with them. The situation became completely untenable when these key holders started overlapping their visits. I came home one afternoon to find 2 people in our apartment, both surprised to see each other, both claiming to be Casey's significant other, both with their own keys and their own understanding of their relationship status with Casey. Casey wasn't even there. They were at work, completely unaware that their 2 supposed partners had discovered each other in our living room and were having a very heated discussion about Casey's honesty and commitment levels. I had to mediate between 2 strangers who were arguing about my roommate's romantic integrity in my own home. That's when I learned Casey had been telling different stories to different people about the nature of their relationships. Some people thought they were exclusively dating Casey. Others believed they were in open relationships, but were Casey's primary partner. A few thought they were just casual hookups, but Casey had given them keys and relationship privileges that suggested otherwise. The aftermath was messy. Several of Casey's romantic interests started showing up at our apartment, demanding explanations, returning keys or collecting belongings they'd left there during their regular visits. Our living room became a revolving door of confrontations, breakups, and dramatic exits that I had to witness whether I wanted to or not. Casey seemed genuinely surprised that their juggling act had collapsed so spectacularly. They couldn't understand why everyone was so upset, claiming they'd never promised exclusivity to anyone, and that all parties should have understood they were in casual, non-committal relationships. But giving someone a key to your apartment and introducing them to your roommate as your partner suggests a level of seriousness that contradicts the casual relationship narrative. Casey had created expectations they couldn't meet while turning our shared living space into the epicenter of their romantic chaos. I gave Casey a month to figure out their relationship situation and establish clear boundaries about guests and keys. I also insisted that any future romantic partners be limited to Casey's bedroom, and that our common areas not be used for managing multiple relationship dramas simultaneously. Casey moved out 3 weeks later, claiming I was being unreasonable about their dating life, and that they needed to live somewhere more supportive of their relationship exploration. They took all the spare keys with them, which was a relief, but I still occasionally get knocks on the door from confused former romantic interests looking for Casey. I'm much more direct about guest policies with potential roommates now, and I specifically ask about their approach to dating and overnight visitors. It never occurred to me that I'd need to establish rules about how many people someone could simultaneously date in our shared living space, but apparently that's a conversation worth having up front. That story ends there. That's basically running a small-scale reality dating show out of a shared apartment without anyone's consent except Casey's. The key distribution situation alone is a nightmare, but turning your roommate into an involuntary relationship counselor for multiple confused partners crosses every possible line. Some people really think their romantic chaos should be everyone else's problem to navigate. This brings us to our final story, which comes from someone who discovered their roommate had some very unconventional ideas about personal space and privacy that went far beyond typical boundary issues. I moved in with my roommate Jordan about 7 months ago, and initially everything seemed perfectly normal. Jordan works in IT, keeps regular hours, and seemed like the ideal low-maintenance roommate. They were quiet, clean, and we rarely crossed paths except for brief conversations about bills or apartment maintenance. What I didn't realise was that Jordan had been conducting what I can only describe as an intensive surveillance operation on my daily life from the moment I moved in. The first signs were subtle things I initially attributed to coincidence or good roommate intuition. Jordan would mention things about my schedule that I'd never told them, like knowing I had early meetings on certain days or that I'd been staying late at work. When I asked how they knew, Jordan would say they'd noticed patterns in when I left and returned, which seemed reasonable enough. But then Jordan started commenting on things that seemed impossible for them to know through casual observation. They'd ask how my phone call with my sister went, or mention that I seemed stressed about a work project I'd never discussed with them. When I asked how they knew about these things, Jordan would give vague answers about being observant or noticing my mood changes. About 2 months in, I started receiving suggestions from Jordan about things I should try or places I should visit that were eerily specific to conversations I'd had in private phone calls or things I'd researched online. Jordan would recommend restaurants I'd looked up, suggest books related to topics I'd been reading about, or mention events that aligned perfectly with interests I'd never shared with them. I began paying more attention to Jordan's behaviour and noticed they seemed to know when I was going to be out of the apartment before I'd told them my plans. They'd mention running errands at the same time I was planning to be away, or they'd be waiting in the living room when I returned from unexpected trips, almost like they'd been tracking my movements. The situation became more concerning when I realised Jordan knew details about my personal communications that they shouldn't have had access to. They'd reference things from my work emails, mention names of people I'd been texting with, or bring up topics from private social media conversations I'd had with friends. One evening, I decided to test my suspicions by having a fake phone conversation in my room about planning to visit a specific museum the next day. I made up details about meeting a friend there and discussed the exhibits I was supposedly excited to see. The next morning, Jordan casually mentioned that the same museum was having a special exhibition and suggested I might enjoy visiting it. That's when I started looking more carefully at my personal electronics and discovered that someone had been accessing my devices remotely. My laptop had software installed that I didn't recognize. My phone had apps running in the background that I'd never downloaded, and my internet router showed connected devices that shouldn't have been there. I confronted Jordan with my suspicions, and their reaction confirmed my worst fears. Instead of denying it or acting surprised, Jordan seemed relieved to finally discuss their monitoring activities. They explained that they'd been conducting what they called a lifestyle optimization study by tracking my habits, communications, and behavioral patterns to help them be a better roommate. Jordan showed me detailed logs they'd been keeping of my daily routines, social interactions, and even emotional states based on analysis of my phone calls and messages. They had charts tracking my sleep patterns, meal times, work schedule, and social activities. They'd been using this information to anticipate my needs and avoid conflicts in our shared living space. According to Jordan, this surveillance was meant to be helpful. They wanted to understand my preferences so they could adjust their own behavior accordingly, like knowing when to be quiet, when to clean common areas, or when I might need space. In their mind, they were being the most considerate roommate possible by gathering data to optimize our living arrangement. But Jordan had also been using this information in ways that went far beyond roommate consideration. They'd been monitoring my financial transactions to understand my spending habits, tracking my location to know when the apartment would be empty, and analysing my communication patterns to learn about my relationships and personal life. When I demanded that Jordan stop all surveillance activities immediately and remove any monitoring software from my devices, they seemed genuinely confused about why I was upset. They couldn't understand how systematic privacy invasion could be problematic when their intentions were to improve our living situation. Jordan agreed to stop the monitoring, but seemed hurt that I wasn't grateful for their efforts to be an ideal roommate. They said most people would appreciate having someone who cared enough to really understand their needs and preferences at such a detailed level. I spent the next week having my electronics professionally cleaned of any monitoring software and changing all my passwords and security settings. I also discovered that Jordan had been accessing my accounts for streaming services, cloud storage, and even some financial apps, supposedly to better understand my lifestyle and interests. Jordan moved out voluntarily after I made it clear that I would be involving law enforcement if any monitoring activities continued. They claimed they were disappointed that I couldn't appreciate their innovative approach to shared living, but respected my preference for privacy over optimization. Since Jordan left, I've had to assume that they have detailed information about my personal life, habits and routines that could potentially be used inappropriately. I've changed my address with important accounts, updated security measures throughout my online presence, and been much more cautious about what information I share in my own home. The most disturbing aspect was Jordan's genuine belief that intensive surveillance was a thoughtful roommate strategy rather than a massive violation of privacy and trust. They seemed to think that good intentions justified any level of personal invasion, which suggests a fundamental disconnect from normal social boundaries. I'm extremely careful about vetting potential roommates now, and specifically ask about their technical skills and approach to privacy. I never imagined I'd need to protect myself from surveillance in my own bedroom, but apparently that's something to consider when living with strangers in the digital age. That concludes our collection of roommate horror stories that prove sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones who split rent with you. From systematic stalkers to boundary-challenged collectors, these tales remind us that sharing living space means trusting someone with access to our most private moments. The next time you're browsing roommate ads, remember these stories and maybe ask a few extra questions about personal boundaries, surveillance equipment, and their definition of shared property. And always check your lease agreement for clauses about behavioral monitoring and unauthorized key distribution. Thanks for listening, and remember to lock your bedroom door.